We'll do this together.
Make sure you share your screen.
Didn't bring them for the easy stuff. Always here for the hard stuff. So, as we begin, let us begin by deconstructing the title. I know you all have heard this before if you're in the class. Deconstruct it, right, Kale? Deconstruct the title. Kale, when we say, where do we go from here, chaos the community, what's the first thing you think? Don't be nervous. What do you think when we hear that particular title? What's the first thing it evokes? Imagery. What is the first thing? Go ahead, Greg. A crossroads, at a crossroads. So to deconstruct the title, he's answering on what we're going to do with this today. We're going to connect this to something contemporary, things that we see contemporary in our social atmospheres. He said, where do we go from here? What about where do we go from here right now, 2022? Will it be chaos or community? So what does Dr. King give us? He gives us an ultimatum. He gives us the parameters by which to answer. He says chaos or community. Does anybody have an answer about this question in 2022? Where do we go as Americans, if you will? Chaos or community? Anybody? Ben, what's your thoughts?
It just makes me think how relevant it is right now, especially in the wake of George Floyd's assassination. Where do we go from there? Chaos or community? And I don't think anybody, well, I think we're headed to chaos. But
okay. And that's being a cynic, but I agree. But the idea of understanding what Dr. King is saying in 1966, 1967, because he writes this book. Can you imagine him writing this book in the middle of all he's doing in 1966 and 1967? And let us isolate 1967 for those of you all who are taking notes, and for those of you all who want a clear understanding, we're going to isolate the year of 1967. That's when he writes it, when his book come out. But think about 1967 and what you may know about 1967. So we want to thank everybody who's joining us. We got the University of Washington, Morgan State's Urban Research Center, Kennedy King College, which is named after Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. on Chicago's South Side, Wyoming Interfaith Network. And then here in Wyoming, we got WWAMI. Good to see WWAMI. Put your hands together for WWAMI because they're here. College of Legal, the College of Legal Clinics with my great friend in the back, the great attorney, Lauren McLean, and her whole group. I see Mr. Klein next to us, so thank them for coming. We have our family at SOAR, and two folks that I have to say thank you to. I have Esther and I have Maya, two TAs who are very dynamic folks. Thank them for being here. College of Arts and Sciences, Multicultural Affairs. Please put your hand together. Learn. And the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and we're off and running. So this is a safe space, you all. So we can have dynamic and courageous and brave conversations from the very beginning, and we're gonna do our best to get through it, but I'd much rather us have a conversation. So feel free. So the exacting statement, and this is one of the reasons I ask you, and one of the things that I ask you to judge our thoughts on today. Lerone Bennett said, in a system of oppression, an educator is either an oppressor or a revolutionary. So I hope that you can inject that into your evaluation of what we put forth today. So he doesn't give you much room. He says one side of the fence or the other. So thinking about being a person who's an oppressor and thinking about the word educator, let's remove this idea of a classroom. All of us have had mentors. All of us have folks who have educated us. Some of us have folks who educate us in what we consider to be some questionable kinds of ways. But we want to make sure that when we talk about Dr. King's legacy, that we look at it through a revolutionary lens. So today we want to use the truth to be able to lay this whole place out, to lay this whole argument out. Here's the idea: social truth, the dominant Eurocentric narrative, which we will challenge at its core. Personal truth, the lived experiences. Forensic truth, quantifiable facts, which we will use. And then the fourth one is the most important, the healing truth. That's where the narrative that addresses injustice and empowers the victim. Dr. King is indeed a victim of his own legacy. We call it a legacy assassination. So to understand that, that's the lens that we'll use. Other books that Dr. King wrote, imagine all that he did to write these books. Stride Toward Freedom, Strength of Love, and Why We Can't Wait. Why We Can't Wait, next to the book that you have in front of you, is probably the most radical. So please make sure that when you're looking at Dr. King, make sure that you understand that we will talk about his rising evolutionary trajectory. The central problem of why we're here, can everybody read this? Can you see it? Well, quickly read this and then we'll move right along. So let's stop right here. I know this camera won't get this. Will it tell me if I walk this way? So the idea of Dr. King and his legacy. What for the most part is Dr. King known for? Can you reach behind? Is it right in there? Can someone break that down? What have you been taught and what is Dr. King most known for or now subjected to? And they'll say what? Civil disobedience. Civil disobedience. So how about a term, Michael? A term that we have systematically laid down for Dr. King that now become what we've all studied before. Anybody? Nonviolence. Nonviolence. Say it again. A dream. But what does it say? I have a dream. So to understand Dr. King and to say I have a dream is to understand basketball and not understand Michael Jordan is better than LeBron James. You got it wrong. So we want to make sure that we get it right. What I mean by that is to understand Dr. King as a dreamer is extremely limiting, it's disrespectful to historical accuracy, and in that particular thought, it leaves us in a situation that we are intellectually deficient. We are historically incorrect. And we as a group needs to understand that when we talk about revisiting Dr. King's, where do we go from here? It's a prerequisite for the reflection of his entire legacy. So to think about that, we need to offset these things that have come with Dr. King. Look at what it says here. This is written by Tyler Smiley. Anybody familiar with Tyler Smiley? Tyler Smiley has now been written out of history, if you will. He's been canceled through the culture. So this is one of the folks that we know have been legitimately burned by society. I'm not saying that it was unjust. I'm not saying that, but it is the truth. He was a great person on television and personality. He said, I've come to firmly believe that in a critical way, he is misunderstood. I believe that misunderstanding is robbed up as the essence of his character and crusade. He said, ironically, his martyrdom has undermined his message. What's the martyrdom of Dr. King? Number one, we have to look at his character assassination, which we will do. Then we need to look at, and this is something for a future day, his physical assassination. Who was involved in that? Because I'm sure that the masses of us don't believe that the United States government played a role in the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Well, I can lay that out to you, but that's for another day. How about his legacy assassination? That's when we talk about his martyr. I have a dream. What's become Dr. King's idea? Now there's a national holiday. Everybody's familiar with that, right? And what do we do that day? Well, both folks who don't even believe in Dr. King, who don't believe in anything that he believes in, gets the day off, don't they? So folks who didn't believe in Dr. King's dream, who mandate him to a dreamer, have a day off. It's pretty interesting. So the idea of the central problem is that his martyrdom has undermined his message and his legacy is now at risk. So when he wrote, where do we go from here? It was the high point of the civil rights movement, transition from civil rights to Black power, published 2 years after the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Does anybody remember what happened around the Voting Rights Act? This idea of now this particular permanent underclass has access to vote. But during 1965, only 2% of Blacks in the Delta were registered to vote. So in 1965, we look at it in this way. There's a hypocrisy that's tied to legislation that you don't necessarily see in the daily lives and the rhythms of those who are the most at risk. Does that make sense? And if it makes sense to you, there's an old term that is tied to the elegance and the understanding of wisdom in Africa. It's called Ashe. That means that we understand and it is the truth. So when I say Ashe, you say Ashe. Ashe? So when I think about this, it's 2 years after the Watts riot. Does anybody remember the Watts riot? About police brutality. I know for a fact that Phil, one of the young men who were involved in that traffic stop was from where?
He grew up all of his school years in Panama.
So when we think about Wyoming's tie to the Watts riot, this was a cry against, a rebellion against police brutality. Dr. King writes this book during this time. The Vietnam War has escalated by this time to 500,000 folks involved, young men, 20–30% Black, representing the underclass. Right? Muhammad Ali refused induction into the U.S. Army. He said what? Those folks never called me the N-word. Everybody remember that? So this is a turbulent time when we think about President LBJ's war against poverty and the long hot summer of 1967. The long hot summer of 1967 in itself was a rebellion in many spaces across the country to direct violence, to police brutality, and most of those spaces, most of those confrontations took place in spaces that had less than 50,000 citizens. So when we think about, this is where he writes this particular book. So what else is Dr. King's life like in 1967? Well, have you ever heard of the FBI's counterintelligence program? Not many have, huh? Counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO. This was their second point. They had more than 5 points, but what's the second point say? Prevent the coalition of the militant Black nationalist groups. Stop a true Black revolution. This was headed by J. Edgar Hoover. So now we're going to get to the core of what Dr. King is looking like and how he felt it in 1967. It says, prevent the rise of a Messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Why would they need to prevent the rise of a Black Messiah? Can anybody answer that for me? Why would they need to prevent the rise of a Black Messiah? Because when the world is in a mess, if you will, God sends a message. When the world is in a war, he sends a warrior. So what do we see here? FBI said there will be one that rises amongst this underclass to do what? Unite the mass. So if you think about it that way, he said Malcolm X might have been such a Messiah. He is the martyr of the movement today. Does anybody understand what that means? That means Malcolm X already assassinated. February 21st, 1965, Harlem Audubon Ballroom was after that. Are we clear? Martin Luther King Jr., Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspired to this position. This is the federal government, your tax dollars doing what? Surveilling individual citizens. And here's the second part of it. This is directed at Dr. King. This is the last part of it. You all who have to do this around the pole, I want to tell you guys a story about that. I just don't have the time, all right? King could be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines and embrace Black nationalism. This is what the United States government said. So if he becomes radical in a way, they have a response for him. Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, which means not long after this is written, not long after the book that you have in front of you was written, Dr. King was assassinated. He's marginalized. This is some of the writings about this book, called The Sellout, rendered irrelevant. The problem of the 20th century is the color line. Dr. King began to repeat this. So he's not this person that you know that said, I have a dream. But let's stop it right there. When he said, I have a dream, do you know that was only the end of that speech, the very end of that speech? Did you hear when he said that Black folk came here today to get a check? And I can't believe that the funds will be insufficient for the United States government. Now, I'm paraphrasing and don't quote, because I'll tell you when I'm quoting. But this idea that Dr. King said this in 1963, do you understand he gives a critique, a scathing critique of white liberalism before the I Have a Dream speech in the London Birmingham jail? So all of us here seem to be attuned to some point, but there are so many of us who are not attuned to any of this. So what I'm going to give you today and over the next 3 weeks will be an education on Dr. King through using his own words that will probably be the most in-depth, empirically accurate that you've heard all your life. Published, this is what the New York Times says. King was calling for a miracle. So the King's legacy in 1967 is not only at war. New York Times again said, as is often the case with those who die young, Martin Luther King Jr. has become a symbol more than a man, a pacifist. I disagree. I disagree totally. And if you write anything down, Dr. King was not a pacifist. He accepted nonviolence as a what? Tactic, as a strategy. So for us to understand Dr. King as a pacifist, that's not correct. This is what the New York Review of Books said. There's something disingenuous about his public voice and about this book. He's under assault. Does everybody understand? Lots of things happened in 19th century. He's outstripped by his times, overtaken by the events. He's not likely to regain command, but his philosophy and these techniques of leadership are no longer valid. Written by this young man, Cocaine. So this is an assault through the media. The media always plays a role in someone's legacy assassination of Dr. King's stature in the community, without question. So one of the key events for Dr. King is the Beyond Vietnam speech. Beyond Vietnam speech. Is anybody familiar with the Beyond Vietnam speech? Many folks say this is the public downfall of Dr. King. What he says, and I quote him, he said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, my own government, and I cannot be silent. But he gives himself a critique. He said, up until now, I've been silent about it because I wanted to have certain connections to Lyndon Baines Johnson. So this pits these two against each other. And just read the quote that he says here. Can you all see that quote? Can you all see the quote? Please read it. And then I have you look at the date. This date, April 4th, 1967. Please tell me when Dr. King was assassinated. Go ahead. So to get to his death, when he gives this speech, do you think that's coincidence or happenstance? That he comes out and gives a scathing critique of one of the most abominable wars in American history? So what else is happening around this time for Dr. King? By 1964, it says the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the New York Times poll found that the majority of New Yorkers said the civil rights movement had gone too far. Those are Northerners. Is everybody clear? Those are aristocrats. Those are Northerners compared to Southerners. What else happens? By 1966, a separate poll found that 78% of Blacks rated Dr. King's job performance in the fight for it as excellent. As polarized, as separated as we are today. How about that? That's the difference between watching CNN and Fox News right there. Isn't it? And how do you incorporate that into your thoughts? A national poll in 1960 said just 2 years before King's death found that only 28% of white Americans had a favorable opinion of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. But everybody marched with Dr. King, didn't they? And now he's this public hero. So it's time to reevaluate it, and it's time to reframe it from a distance that allows for us, and particularly for the youngest person here, to understand Dr. King much different. And here's Dr. King himself. Great majority of Americans spend it between opposing attitudes. They are uneasy with injustice, but unwilling to pay a significant price to eradicate it. Boom. You don't get any better than using his own words. He said to involve a lunch counter to make that integrated cost you nothing. In fact, you did what? You benefited from it. But the money that you're using in the Vietnam War, those billions of dollars could easily make life much more middle-class life, much more attainable for those who are a part of the permanent underclass. So I'm going to step through this through a way the students know best. But I'm going to step through this through the introduction, the forward, and then we'll do 1 and 2, and then we'll wrap it up. Ashe? Ashe. So Vincent Harding, who wrote a book about Black Power, please write his name down, Vincent Harding. He wrote a book on Black Power with Stokely Carmichael in 1967. So he actually writes the forward in this. And what does he say? King insisted on constantly raising and reflecting the basic questions he posed in the first chapter of this work. Where are we? That's chapter 1. Where are we? Let's ask ourselves that. Where are we as a nation, as a society, as a community? Where are we? Are we pitted against each other now? Is it so sensationalized that folks don't want to listen to different opinions right now? Is it the fact that it's gotten so violent to be of certain hues, of certain background, of certain nationality? How about if you go to a school board meeting, might be one of the most dangerous places in the world for you to be? is at a school board meeting where they're saying what? This is critical race theory. Somehow, we have to tie this into Wyoming. That's where it becomes real. That's where Dr. King becomes part of what you think every day. So what else does he say? King uses these pages of the book to move beyond the narrow legalistic understanding. That's Brown versus Board of Education. Everybody clear? What else is that? That's the 64 Act, the 65 Act that we have pointed out in hypocrisy to newer, deeper, less traveled direction. What is that saying about Dr. King? He's re-emerging himself. He's reinventing himself. He still believes nonviolence is the approach. So the foreword, which was written by his wife, Loretta Scott, what did she say? He not only took on responsibility of leadership, he tore vigorously to offer discerning leadership. That means he questioned his own leadership. What else is it? Poverty as a source of the world's stability, arrogance of wealth of nations toward the deprived world. There's the class analysis. Is everybody clear? There's the class analysis. So Dr. King is given a gender analysis, a class analysis, and much more of a human analysis than a civil rights analysis. So we're gonna go through the main problem, main purpose, the thesis, theoretical perspective, and what's at stake for each chapter. This will allow for us to have a critical review of Dr. King's work through contextual analysis. So the main problem, chapter 1, white America was ready to demand that the Negro should be spared the last of brutality and coarse degradation, but it never had been truly committed to helping him out of poverty, exploitation, and all forms of discrimination. That's not a dream, that's reality. Now I'm gonna need a little help on a few of these. So I'm gonna ask a few of you all to help me. But the main problem he talks about here, what do you see here? What's the overarching connection here? How about this being hypocrisy? Dr. King lays it out. So when we think about the main problem in chapter 1, that's one way to look at it. With Selma and the Voting Rights Act, one phase of development came to an end. What is he saying there? After we allowed for you to vote, after we allowed for you to do X, Y, and Z, it was over. Equity had been achieved. So he gives a critique here of understanding the difference between legislature and how that aligns with folks' daily rhythms. Heidi, can you read that for me?
For a vast majority of white Americans, the past decade, the first phase, have been a struggle to treat the Negro with a degree of decency, not of equality.
What do you think about that, Heidi? He gives it two ways. Treat them with decency, but not equality. What do you think about that, Heidi?
I think it implies a very superficial sense of, like to use the word presented decency and acceptance, but not actual change in the structure of daily life.
Actual change would be what? Power dynamic.
Yeah.
To give up power and give it to the permanent underclass. Those who were once what? Slaves. The United States is still not having that kind of understanding right now today. It's okay that we live amongst each other in a more equitable society. Do you really understand that? So now we're in the middle of gentrification, right? All across the country, it's already happening, right? Urban renewal, correct? Urban renewal has historically meant Negro removal. Historically. So to understand that, the main problem is pretty clear. Then we'll go to the main purpose. Toby, can you read that for me?
Yeah, the practical cost of change for the nation up to this point has been cheap. The limited reforms have been obtained at bargain rates. There are no expenses and no taxes are required for Negroes to share lunch counters, libraries, parks, hotels, and other facilities with whites.
What is it saying? Anybody?
It hasn't cost any money.
Yeah.
There's no change in the power.
In fact, you have benefited better in a more deep way because now we are and can spend our money in your stores. So he says to share lunch counters has nothing to do with equality. Share a library has nothing to do with equality. To share a park, a hotel, other things that have been humanized for years really benefited those folks who decided that at this particular point, it's a much easier way to look at desegregation. More significant changes involved in voter registration themselves require large monetary, neither large monetary nor psychological sacrifice. What's a psychological sacrifice? And let's look at this through this lens. Desegregation versus integration. Everybody please write that down. Desegregation versus integration. What's the difference there? Tyler, what you think? Between the two, desegregation, let's separate them out, and integration. So to desegregate a space is law, correct? To integrate a space is spirit. Does that make sense? To say, I will sit next to you, to say that is much different than say that I'll say that you're human. I will attack the dehumanization that you've gone through to make it easier for you to have something of a resemblance of a life. Negroes live in substandard housing, and Negroes have half the income of whites. When we return to negative experiences of life, the Negro has a double share. That's Dr. King, 1967. That's not a dream, that's reality. So thinking of Dr. King giving these scathing critiques is not what's taught about Dr. King. Can anybody tell me why would we use a book like this in an introduction to any kind of class? Let's say psychology, let's say sociology. And we talk about teaching across the curriculum, don't we then? We talk about teaching across the curriculum. Why is Dr. King's true nature? Because we can wrap this up right now if we can have a conversation. Why is Dr. King's true nature so far removed from the reality of who he is that now we have a group of people here, and that group is getting older and older and older who don't have a clue about Dr. King. And think about Dean being here and the great Miss Sanchez being here because they think it's important. And think about this community and think about this college campus and think about who's not. I'm getting this scared and it's Dr. King at this point, right? Every civil rights law is still substantially more dishonored than honor. School desegregation is still 90% unimplemented across the land. Now we live in a more segregated space than we did when Dr. King in 1967 put this together. Right now, pretty interesting. Everybody seeing these words on the side, the thesis, the theoretical perspective? There is not a common language when the term equality is used. Negroes and whites have a fundamentally different definition. We could stop it right there. Fundamentally different thoughts. Why? Because we have fundamentally different experiences. We have fundamentally different heroes. We have fundamentally different what? Those who are enemies. So Dr. King in this space is letting you know that in 1967, we have no commonality. How about in 2022? Obviously, if you're here, it's something about what you want to learn, something you want to discuss. But what is Dr. King saying here? We are fundamentally so separated, it might as well be slavery. Pretty interesting the way that he takes off on that. A good many observers have remarked that if equality could come at once, the Negro would not be ready for it. There's some folks who really feel that even amongst each other, that some folks are not fit to be a part of society. There's still large amounts of people who live like that every day. So it may work itself out in dealing with someone at Walmart. It may work itself out. You being the person who's automatically already been pointed at for being screened when you fly. It has so much flexibility in what he's saying that folks really believe that this Negro population is not ready. So let's think about that. How about that in 2022? So what's at stake? 10 years ago, Negroes seemed almost invisible to the larger society, and the facts of their harsh lives were unknown to the majority of the nation. Today, civil rights is dominating every issue in every state, crowding the pages of the press and daily conversations of white America. That's what he's talking about. That's what it states in chapter 1. that they've gone from this underclass population, not those who removed themselves and went to the north, but those who stayed in the south. Look to his face and look to his thoughts on Montgomery. If you want, please everybody write this down. It's called, it's a 1957 speech. It's called, Facing the Challenge of the New Age. Dr. King lays out what the civil rights movement will look like. This is right after the victory in Montgomery. It's called Facing the Challenge of a New Age. So what's at stake with chapter 1 is that he gives a critique, and then he talks about now you have to deal with civil rights. Mass marches transformed the common man into the star performer and engaged him in a commitment. Yet nonviolent resistance caused no explosions of anger. It instigated no riots. It controlled anger and released it under discipline for maximum effort. So he's patting himself on the back. These folks that you call the permanent underclass literally changed society. Let's look at the intelligence agencies. By 1968, United States Defense Department. Look at all of these people who are surveilling Dr. King. Only a year later. That means that was already happening in 1967. Everybody clear that. That didn't happen because it went to 1968. If you understand Dr. King, his father and his grandfather had been surveilled by those agencies before he was born. Chapter 2, Black Power. What's the first thing you think about when you hear that term, Black Power? Anybody? Counter to a non-violent narrative. Everybody else, first thing you think about when you hear Black Power? Stokely Carmichael wrote the book. Brianna, what's the first thing you think about?
I think of the term power and then kind of, I don't know, I guess just maybe in the same way that Black people and white people have different conceptions of equality.
Okay.
Different conceptions of power.
What's weird, it's a challenge to the status quo. Anybody else? It is a challenge to the status quo. It puts these hypocritical thoughts, these inequities in a space where we have to discuss. So I'm going to fast forward through a few. And then I'm going to open this up for conversation. So chapter 2 in itself. Chapter 2 in itself, and I'll make this available. What's the state with chapter 2? Let's go straight to it. Ms. Sanchez, can you read that for me, please?
The oppression of Negroes by whites has left an understandable residue of suspicion. Some of the suspicion is a healthy and appropriate safeguard. An excess of skepticism, however, becomes better and denies that there can be reliable white allies, even though some whites have died heroically at the sides of Negroes in our struggle, and others have risked economic and political peril to support our cause.
Dr. King understood the power of Black Power. He just did not like the term. Is everybody clear? Why didn't he like the term? He said it would isolate the movement. What else did he say it would do? He said it would end some friendships with white moderates. So by 1967, Dr. King has been in the struggle since 1955. He's a veteran. That's a kind way to put it. So in between this, we see Black Power, and then we see the intergenerational discontinuities. Anybody familiar with the intergenerational discontinuity? That means in between these young and the old do not get along. How many times young folks have you challenged your parents? It happens every day. It's bound for the young to pursue leadership in a movement. So now you see Black Power as what? A youth movement, an outgrowth of civil rights. So now the goals change. Goals of the civil rights movement was to incorporate into white institutions as equal. The goal of Black Power was to control all organizations and entities inside the Black community. Do you see the shift? Nonviolence, direct action as a tactic. Black power, armed self-defense as a response to police brutality. You see the difference. Then the age difference, the generational difference, the understanding of differences. And when we think about civil rights, largely controlled by educated, formally educated, elder, white, black, me. Not so for Black Power. Black Power was taken to the streets and left in this idea of what we should think about. What happens after this? By 1966, what do we see? 36% of white people said King was helping the cause. 85% of white people surveyed said that demonstration by Negroes and civil rights hurt the advancement of that cause. 30% of Black response felt the same. So by the time he is assassinated in 1968, 72% of Americans had an unfavorable view of King. But everybody marched for Dr. King. Where do we go from here? Chaos of community. When Dr. King was assassinated, here's a poll. The poll in itself said 38 folks considered and felt sadness, 5% anger, 15% shame, 10% fear, 31% felt that he brought it on himself. That's the America that we're dealing with now. So far divided that we can't have a conversation. Where do we go from here? Chaos of community. How do we tie that to something contemporary? Where do we go from here? Chaos of community. Dr. King leaves us a blueprint. Assassination of Dr. King, April 12, 1968, right around 6 p.m. Memphis, Tennessee, where we're going to one thing out. This man right here, the man is standing over Dr. King. Everybody write this down. His name is Merrill McCullough. Merrill McCullough was an FBI operative through the Memphis Police Department. So as he's taking his last breath, who's standing over him? So to understand the power of Dr. King and his legacy, we have come to give good news. We've come to give a good way of looking at Dr. King that's not so readily available for the youngest person in the youngest person who's online. So as we wrap up, chapter 1 and chapter 2, set the pace. Did anybody look at title to chapter 3? Dr. Christina Rivers from DePaul University will be here next week. We're gonna feed you again. Come back out. A political scientist out of DePaul University. Can you tell me the name of chapter 3? Racism in the white backlash. For many of you all, this may be outside of the norm of having conversations, but for the young folks, let me explain this to you. The majority of your teaching that you are being forwarded is for folks 50 and 100 years ago. For the youngest one in this room, your mind is curtailed and ready for teaching from 100 years from now. So in my profession, there's a critical mass of folks who aren't prepared to teach you for 100 years because they're caught up in 100 years behind. So what do I mean by that? Think about psychology. If a student comes to the University of Wyoming who has aspirations to study psychology, and that means psychology represents the absolute. It could be the absolute. We can understand it in a way that could be absolute. We can teach it in a way that could be absolute. But what normally happens? Psychology, you got to study who? Somebody give me one name. Freud. Freud and who else? Young, right? So automatically they're what? Curtailed into this idea of reasoning from another human that limits the idea of what should be said. So Young and Freud, very important folks, but they're only two people out of how many that would control or represent the absolute. So to understand Freud and Young is to understand two different brilliant people's perspective on the absolute. Is that clear? And to understand that for a young person is very minimized, very limited. So their education is not, but what the education is at that point is very minor. Education in itself, if you think about it, in the absolute, it should be what? Infinite. So now, as we wrap up, we got about 10 minutes, maybe a little bit less. Anybody got any questions, any comments? Go ahead, Toby.
What do you think of MLK's proposition that the slogan that should have been used in lieu of Black Power was power before or for power?
I think Dr. King says it from the position of a Southern, formally educated Christian preacher, where all that he's gone through still doesn't overwhelm him about this idea of what he called his beloved community. Is anybody familiar with Dr. King's beloved community? In that, he talked about how there's equality that can be extracted from our society. So I think Dr. King, we have to look at through his perspective. We have to be able to say that when he says Black power, he understands it. He just doesn't like the term. Make sure you're clear on it. He understands tenets. He understands the ideas. He understands the paradigm. And he agrees with all of that. You'll find that in chapter 2. Just doesn't like the term. So he has to add a term. He has to inject the term. Now, don't get me wrong, Dr. King is one of the most brilliant men that we have known. So I hope that answers the question. Go right ahead.
Do you think that as MLK has kind of become this sort of sign and symbol, do you think that it's part of the broader American ideology? Do you think the American ideology is bigger than MLK?
Absolutely. I think Dr. King right now fits well in the larger ideology of his character assassination, his physical assassination, which leads to his legacy assassination. You all, for the most part, we don't understand what is meant by folks who make kings, who make presidents. Only a certain group of people with a certain amount of power can erect a person's legacy after they're dead. Does that make sense? Only a certain amount of people have that power. So now Dr. King in 1860 has what, a national holiday. So that's the event I have you look at. Now we celebrate Dr. King, when if we understand what was said, Dr. King was hated by 78% of folks when he died. So I really believe that Dr. King is more valuable dead. He can't speak for himself. And furthermore, Dr. King is now become this symbol of what? The exact opposite of what he really was. So that's like turning somebody upside down, inside out. Having your friend be your enemy, your enemy be your friend, and you don't know it. Bobby Wright calls it mental side. Your mental ability to be able to evaluate accurately has been killed, has been blamed, has been assassinated by a large society. Hope that answers your question. Go right ahead, Bob.
You mentioned nonviolence as an issue. I think we talk a little bit about
Dr. King understood that violence begets violence. What did he say? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, gonna leave everybody half blind. So I think that Dr. King, if you understand Dr. King, let's go back to the Montgomery bus boycott. When Dr. King first started that movement, and he becomes this leader at 26 years old for the Montgomery Improvement Association. I said he was sitting at Dr. King's house on the couch, he was sitting on the gun. If you understand Dr. King. So he makes a clear decision to say nonviolence will be the way for the masses of folks. And then he begins to believe in nonviolence because he sees what it does. But as a tactic to do what? He thought that if they were on TV, then the world would have sympathy for what was going on, the beatings that were taking place, the use of hoses, the use of dogs on men, women, and children. And think about those last two, women and children. This was on your nightly news. This is before Twitter, right? So for us to understand that Dr. King wanted to shame these folks that he said he loved, he said you gotta love them because you can't like them the way they treat you. So to understand that non-violence, the other option of that title was violence. And he said violence against violence. So he used it as a strategy and a technique to do what? Arm the mass. I'm still not the one to believe in going into a space and using my body to get beat, to ask folks to change legislation, change the way they feel about me is a tactic that I believe in. No. But it was a tactic, and obviously Dr. King used it in a way that's been very brilliant in his own mind. And outwardly too. As we wrap it up, how about one more? We got two more. Go right ahead.
So with the white majority, in the first chapter in the sixties and their misrepresentation or misunderstanding of equality, if you were to draw like a parallel between today and then, do you believe the like buzz term today now is anti-racist, everybody is anti-racist? Do you believe there is a similarity in that with a misunderstanding underlying that with white majority?
I think there was. I think it's very clear now. What's your name?
Charlie.
Let me explain two events. The 2008 election of Barack Obama allowed for us to say for 8 years, we are post-racial. When if you understand, this is something you can write down, there's an article called Targeted by Hate. That was an article that was written out of the New York Times the night that President Obama became president-elect. And he was threatened. His life was threatened. That night, more time than any other president. We talking Lincoln, Nixon, Reagan. His life was threatened more that night than anyone. So during that time, those 8 years, which for some of you all out here formative years. Some of you have had a black president for 8 years, which represents the bulk of your life. The people that are young. I never believed it was gonna happen. Using this story. I live in Chicago, I'm from Chicago. I was teaching the class at night, steps away from where they had that party, that Rice party that they had. Steps away from it. They were going to the party, I was going the other way. All night class, going the other way, because there's no way that America is going to let the black. So after this Barack Obama phenomenon comes the rising of Donald Trump. There's no way in the world that after the election of Donald Trump, we can say we're post-racial. We're doing Barack Obama, a little bit more easy to say, even though the facts, the empirical evidence doesn't weigh it out. But now we look at it and say, well, there's no question if we're post-racial. I think there was a time which represents only 8 years, and that's a drop in the bucket in American history, that we can even claim. Hope that answers your question. Go ahead, Lauren. This will be the last one.
Each lawyers of my current one view lawyers sitting with me here.
Okay, that's great.
This is on criminal justice reform or benefit perhaps abolition, but
Okay.
nevertheless, Dr. King talks about this collection of laws and statutes that are but a very unequal framework. Legislation that is debated, substantially nullified, and unenforced in the mockery of law. And I just want to point out, I mean, that's what we're dealing with every day. You know, we recently represented a black man up in the leg who got killed for following too closely. So think about that for a second. He's following too closely. And there wasn't a law on the books that we could use to help him. Not the 4th Amendment, not the 14th Amendment, nothing. Instead, he was convicted and we had to beg the judge to not sentence him to prison for 8 to 10 years for his first felony offense that the white prosecutor was back about. We had to beg that judge. And thank God we got him 2 years probation. He fought like hell. But I just want to reiterate what he's saying here is still true. I don't have a law on the books where I can help a person of color. I don't. And yet, and I don't want to go into the politicized debate on abortion. What I do want to point out is that jobs is taking place already in all of our states. The jobs decision is already happening. That law already has effect. But the 14th Amendment still doesn't have any effect at all. So I just find that just unbelievable, one and two.
Anybody agree? Anybody want to comment? How about a comment? I think Lauren is as clear as any other lawyer, more so than any lawyers that I know. You know, lawyers, you have to. Anybody wants to piggyback on what she said as we wind this up? I think that she makes a great point. I'm glad, I bet it's a very grand news that they would have like, yeah, okay. Go ahead, out of there, then you can go right behind it.
This happened here, like in any other place. If we follow the laws, we wouldn't be charged with a felony. No, we'd be just let off the hook. Come with a ticket or something. But that, like a person of color, no, they get arrested and they get sent to jail for like 8 to 10 years for following too closely to a car. That seems way too, like, oh my god, that just seems wrong.
I mean, why would you pain a little bit, my friend? So that was the reason he got pulled over by police. And then from there, it proceeded like any other police encounter with non-consensual activity searches. The search turned up some stuff. And he had reasons for why that stuff was there. I got prosecuted for a felony offense.
Okay.
So it's a
That-
bit.
we needed to hear that part.
But nevertheless, what you're feeling is should still be safe.
Absolutely, it's at the core. That's
Important
cool.
to understand that interaction, that circumstance does not come up if not for his race. and
Sure.
Not for very minor traffic violations that allow for the intervention of police in completely anonymous situations.
And then John.
Yeah, like just thinking about the comparison between, abolitionist movement, as it relates to people of color and then also abortion. You know, I view the reason why there's been such quick action on the abortion front is because it's once again putting a perceived, like less powerful demographic back in place. You know, whereas when you're talking about having a law, that's giving more power to a group of people that they're the best interest. So like that to me is the distinction there, that we're seeing this, you know, equal and opposite goal on that front, but it comes from the same place.
John?
In the equality state, it's not happening to the lab, it happens on the reservation, it's happening all over the state. That's all I can say is equality state.
Go ahead, Esther, because I'm not gonna reply to that, John.
That means African Americans is the reason for the person, so it's not.
Absolutely.
That it's not gonna be able to work.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the problem with American systems, is the fact that its laws were created as an antithesis to the existence of people of color. Because it was not meant to work for them. So that would be my opinion.
Agreed. We have a question here. This is one of our good friends out of Florida. We are very thankful that you have made it through thus far through Ian. She said, how do I honor Dr. King's legacy as I fight for federal hunger and insecurity programs that were established in 1964 in our community? She goes back to legislature. She goes back to a time that ties us to Dr. King. How do you continue to fight? I think she asked a really good question. How do we continue to ask the question? Where do we go from here? Chaos of community with Dr. King and I. Anybody got any thoughts? Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Go right ahead, Tom.
Start thinking about that psychological price.
Okay.
That we have today. You mentioned this in the,
Chapter 1.
uh,
Psychological price that we have. Does that mean that the psychological price in itself will permit us to be, if you will, a little bit more human toward each other? Well, we've got hundreds of years of dehumanization. Think about it on the book. Esther just said 3/5 of a person. That's taxation and representation, correct? What else do we see? We see in 1900 the eugenics movement. Anybody familiar? This is America. We see the Tuskegee syphilis there. This is America. Where do we go from here? Chaos of community. Is it possible? that we move forward from here. What does that look like? Is it possible? Is it possible that we build community over chaos? Well, let's just say this, chapter 1, where we are. Where are we? Are we in chaos or community? For young people, how do we get to community? Because my generation has left you in a hell of a position. And asked you to do what? Don't pay attention to it. Just get a little bit older and you'll agree with those folks who are either on this side or on this side. You'll find your way to those places. How disrespectful is that of you? If you understand how important you think it is. Where do we go from here? Chaos of community. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., chapters 1 and 2. Thank you all for listening. This information may in no means change your mind, just because truth in you are so important. I just thought you ought to know. Thank you all so much. Now, where I'm from, a couple of things need to happen. Somebody needs to clean up. The other thing before all that, somebody needs to take these pieces of cake with them. So please, everybody needs something. Please, please, everybody needs something.
Well, so I'm actually visiting again.